When we want to give expression to dramatic situations in our lives, we tend to use metaphors of heaviness. We say that something has become a great burden to us. We either bear the burden or fail and go down with it. We struggle with it, win or lose. And Sabina, what had come over her? Nothing. She had left a man because she felt like leaving him. Had he persecuted her? Had he tried to take revenge on her? No. Her drama was a drama not of heaviness, but of lightness. What fell to her lot was not the burden, but the unbearable lightness of being. Milan Kundera.
I'd like to start out. What's your favorite Milan Kundera novel, and what did it teach you about leadership?
First of all, I love all of his books, and I've read most of his books. But if I have to choose the one that actually affected and influenced my leadership style and how I treat business and how I treat my career, I will have to go with The Joke. And the reason is, definitely The Joke. And the biggest lesson I got from The Joke is that pettiness doesn't only destroy lives, but it also stalls your career. Because basically it's a book about a person who, he got wronged, but then he held a grudge. So his entire life was about planning a revenge. And then when he finally got his revenge, he realized that something that for him meant so much, and being petty and holding to this hate and holding to this revenge, for everyone else it meant nothing. And all the others had moved on. They had a different life. They were in different situations, but he was still mentally there. And that for me was amazing at that point. I realized that it doesn't matter if somebody has wronged you. You probably would never make them understand. But if it is to make them understand, it should be with your actions. And it should be by taking the higher road and just moving forward and focusing on yourself and your work.
Nice. Hey, Jesan. I like it.
So I will admit, I was only introduced to Milan Kundera a couple of years ago, which is a tragedy. But right along with Václav Havel and a lot of those other writers, as we began to explore on the podcast, my own podcast, the vagaries of totalitarian and tyrannical nightmares. And so I'm a big fan of The Unbearable Lightness of Being. I had heard about that book, obviously, before, but I never really had an opportunity to get a hold of it. And the lesson that I learned from that book that can apply to leadership, it really applies to our conversation today, maybe Jodah can take something from this as well, is the acidity of moral weakness. And so
Jodah needs to learn about the acidity of moral weakness. That's for sure. I can testify.
You know me too well, Jesan.
It is, and that's what this book is about. It's about two people who are basically cheating on each other, but they are inside of a system of lies. They're inside a system of lies that, much like Václav Havel, the greengrocer puts up the sign that says "Workers of the World Unite," but he doesn't care about the workers of the world, and he doesn't care if they unite or not. He just wants to sell apples. And so why is he putting up that sign? Well, he's putting up that sign because he's participating in lies in the culture. And when you participate in lies in the culture, that leads all the way down to the substructure of individual interactions. And that was one of the key insights that Kundera had, that I think ranks him along with Havel and Alexander Solzhenitsyn. And even, I would even say, we most recently read Viktor Frankl's Man's Search for Meaning. He's in that order of authors who really understood the corrosive power of lies. And again, the acidity of moral weakness.
Yeah. For me, I like, my favorite is Immortality, which was released in 1990, at least in the United States. And what I learned from that, there's a lot I've learned from that. And I've actually been rereading it or listening to it to prepare for this podcast. And I love going back to books because you forget. I've read a lot of Milan Kundera. I've read The Joke. I've read the book of Laughter and Forgetting, and also, of course, Unbearable Lightness of Being. And he says in Immortality, he should have actually titled Immortality The Unbearable Lightness of Being at one point in the book. But when rereading it, recently, he introduces this concept called imageology, which is kind of a variation or a play on ideology that I think is a fascinating concept that I'd like to talk about later in this podcast. Because when I was reading it, it got me to thinking about King Solomon's old phrase from Ecclesiastes, that there's nothing new under the sun, right? And we think things are different now because we have social media and the internet. But a lot of the things that we feel like are impacting our society in those spheres, he's talking about in immortality. And so it's kind of a thread that kind of ties modernity together. So, and I also just really appreciate the poetry of his book. I think he pushes back against being a psychological writer, but he has a depth of thought that he brings to his fiction and a philosophical point of view, which I agree with. And of course, that is rooted in his experience living in Czechoslovakia during the Russian occupancy or the Soviet Union occupancy. So how about you, Jodah? What's your favorite Milan Kundera book?
All right. I will start off by saying my first introduction to Milan Kundera. Milan Kundera is much different than any of yours. My 10th grade year, I ditched the entire year. I didn't want to go to school. I will not say that I was so bright that it bored me. Although I was bored, but I don't think it was because I was so bright. I lived a very Southern California lifestyle for a year with my friends, and we'd go to the beach.
Were you a beach bum, Jodah?
I would do all sorts of things.
I bet.
And we were, how old? 10th grade. Figure out what that age. I don't remember. And that was a time when they introduced the thing where they'd call your house at the end of every day. So I have to be home at a particular time to catch the phone call. It was a whole thing, but more trouble than it probably really was worth for that year. But I got busted. And we were in the room with my counselor, who kind of, who oversees a certain set of the student body. And I just remember him saying to my father, he goes, Doug, I think the problem here with Jodah is he's having a crisis with an unbearable lightness of being. And my dad looked at me like, wow, what a great phrase. I'm like, wow. So very wise counselor, but he also turned out to be an a-hole. But I think looking back with what I know about Milan, and I would say he was probably correct. Fast forward a couple of years, I did go see the movie with my father, probably because of that. Which
Milan Kundera hated that movie, by the way.
Did he? Okay, yeah. Well, and I wouldn't say I liked it that much either, honestly. But I was also, again, it was probably above my head. Wasn't the right age. I wasn't in the right headspace. I didn't think it was horrible, but I just,
Actually, he wrote Immortality, I think. He has a passage in Immortality where he talks about writing novels to make sure that they can never be adapted into movies.
Yeah,
that's how much it scarred him.
Yeah. Well, that's a lot of, right. Well, maybe he should have had other movies. Yeah. So anyways, with that said, my experience in Milan is very limited. I started to read Unbearable Lightness of Being since there seems to be the connection in my life there. I probably got a third of the way through it. I am picking up on the themes that you guys are talking about. I remember I called Dan. I go, Dan, I think he's an existentialist. And Dan's all, yeah, bro. I'm like, okay, all right. So I got to catch up with this guy. So I think that's kind of how we're kicking off this episode, guys.
Well, you I care about though,
this show is about sense making. This show is about leadership. This show is about trying to keep that shit interesting. And I want to know why the hell I should give a damn about Milan Kundera. And what does he mean for society, and organizations, and leaders? Like, what am I gaining?
Come on,
I'm not saying this is a value to society.
Because, Dan, can I help you out? Let me help you out here. Let me jujitsu this man here a little bit. Look, Jodah, the reason you should care about
skepticism out of him.
well, I'm gonna cuddle it out of him very gently.
Cuddle it.
And I think Zoe would agree with me about this. Kundera was obsessed with the idea of what type of people are created by the situations and circumstances they are in if there is an absence of the transcendent. And we've talked about this on the podcast before with you guys, right? So we used to make sense, and I loved how Dan framed it in terms of modernity. We used to make sense of the world through Christianity. Nietzsche killed all that. Okay, fine. How do you make sense now? Well, Kundera was consumed with that, and he was layering that underneath the ideology of communism, which claimed that it could make sense without God. And he fundamentally didn't buy that. And that's, by the way, why he might have been a collaborator. He might have been a little bit of a shady gangster. Because if you're in a system that's built on lies, like I talked about with Unbearable Lightness of Being, then you're automatically living underneath a tyranny. And tyrannical times create weak men, and then weak men lead other people weakly. And so what do you get? You just got weakness everywhere, and no one has any moral strength, right? And Kundera, I believe, was obsessed with that. And you can see that in some of his other works, like The Joke, where you're talking about grudges. I mean, why am if I can't let go of a grudge, that means I'm holding on to something that's giving me meaning in a world that is meaningless.
How about you, Zoe? How are you going to convince Jodah that reading Milan Kundera will enlighten him about leadership and sense making?
Well, for starters, I'm going to tell you one lesson that he taught me, that he said so clearly that I think that if everyone could actually grasp this lesson and actually understand it and learn it, then their careers and their leadership style would be so much more successful. So in one of his books, he said that when you ask someone what they like and what they don't, you shouldn't take into consideration their answers based on what really they like or not, but only as to assess, based on their value system, what they think that they should like and that they should want. So basically what he said is that you can't know if they do like or not like what they tell you, and you shouldn't care about that, but it shows you a lot about their values and their belief system. It shows you where they think their values should be based and what they think is important. So it doesn't give you information about them, but it does give you information about how you should be towards those people in order to gain their trust. If that's not a leadership lesson, then I don't know what it is. I rest my case. Like so many people, they work in corporation and it takes them forever and they don't understand a single thing. They say, but this person told me that. And then you have to ask them, what about their actions? If you don't focus on what they said and if you don't focus on what you think they should say, and you actually focus on their daily behaviors, the only thing that's real, what message do you get from that?
Right. The only thing that's real in a society and culture where talk is cheap and increasingly cheaper and cheaper over the course of the 20th century, during which time Milan was living and working. And you really have to look at his background, right? So like he was not a person who, well, let's put it this way. Actions matter more than speech because words are a dime a dozen. Everybody can say stuff. Blah, 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 blah. We could popcorn on that all day. But, Dan, what are you actually going to do when the chips are down? What is Jesan going to do when the chips are down? What's Zoe going to do when the chips are down? So talk is cheap.
Yeah. And another thing that I find interesting is how Milan always, in every book he made, he found a way to deconstruct the interpretation of people's motivations in order to show you that this thing that this protagonist, interpreted like that, how different it is in real life. And that's also a big lesson to get, that every time you dive into someone's motivation, you basically lose track from reality. For example, I remember I think it was a Goodbye Valse, but again, I'm translating back from Greek, so maybe in English the title of the book is different. So there was this girl, and she was very promiscuous, so she had a lot of lovers, etc. And there was this super playboy guy, and she refused to sleep with this guy. And in his mind, he explained this decision as a very charming decision, because he said that basically she's doing me a favor, because that's how she shows how important I am. She sleeps so easily with everyone else, but me, who I'm so special, she doesn't want to sleep with because I'm so special.
Right,
and
we all want to make
that sounds like a male reversal. way to reverse rejection, bud. All right.
Yeah.
But on the other hand, so many people do that, don't they? They get rejected and they find a way to feel good about it. They get on the other side, someone tells something good and they say, no, they just try to manipulate me. It's not really genuine. So what he wants to show you is that if you go that rabbit hole, you're lost. You will never know. Just focus on yourself, what you want to take. Otherwise, everything else is just for laughs.
Well, okay, but don't you become a tyrant with yourself though? Like you become a tyrant with yourself and a tyrant with each other when you sort of descend into that. And I always got the sense from Kundera's work that he was kind of, I wouldn't say tongue in cheek about it, but he wasn't all that serious.
He wasn't.
Picking up on something there? Yeah. Okay. All right. It's a little tongue in cheek.
I think that for me, it's the opposite of what you say. It's not about becoming a tyrant. If anything, I think that all of his books and all of his work is about taking life less seriously and taking yourself less seriously and being a little bit not cynical in the Bukowskian way, but more cynical in this is life. It's bad. It's bad for all of us. Let's admit that we all suffer. The last thing we can do and the least we can do is laugh about it. That's all.
Right.
Let's find a way and laugh all together about how hard and how zero sense it's making, to leave it.
And I want to throw my weight in to try and convince Jodah that looking at Milan Kundera and all literature is important, from a leadership perspective. And I think both Jesan and Zoe, we've talked about this on other podcasts as well, podcast episodes as well, that I think in terms of leadership, we can think about systems, we can read books, textbooks on leadership and transformational leadership and looking at behaviors. But I think kind of getting back to think about the Greeks and Plato and the Greeks, I'm looking at Zoe, and Plato and Aristotle, and the idea of the wise leader and the worldly leader. Like reading literature gives you a broader perspective about humanity and gives you some of that empathy. And I think what Milan Kundera also brings is a philosophical framework, an existential philosophical framework to kind of make sense of what's happening in the world. Because again, nothing's new under the sun. I mean, we're seeing the same patterns because we're all human beings. We're just different generations dealing with different technology. And you can go back and look at a book like Immortality from 1990 and say, wow, I can map themes from that book to Zoe getting canceled, which we'll talk about later in this episode, on Greek Twitter. I can map those themes. So I think looking at literature and looking at good writers like Milan Kundera, who are deep, thoughtful writers, can broaden your way of thinking about the world, and that will make you a more effective leader. So did we convince you, Jodah?
Well, I'll respond to that and say I think Jesan had a follow-up to what you just said. I feel like. I think,
I did have a follow-up, and this is my only follow-up. And then I'm waiting with bated breath. My breath is literally bated to see what Jodah would say, which is rare for me. My breath is almost never bated. I breathe just fine. But I'm
certainly very disappointed.
Kundera's work overlaps with Gabriel Garcia Marquez's work. So he wrote 100 Years of Solitude. That's his most famous work. Marquez was trying to do the same thing, but in a Latin American context, and trying to do it with magical realism, which comes again out of that very specific Latin American context. And you're seeing these writers who are responding to the mid-20th century dynamics of the Cold War. And what's interesting to me as an amateur historian is, and I think Zoe's probably about 15 years younger than I am, if I may be so generous. People who are a little bit younger than me, they don't know the Cold War. They just don't know. We don't teach it in America anymore. It's one tiny paragraph in an 8th grade textbook, and then everybody sort of moves on. We go World War II, which, by the way, composes of Pearl Harbor, D-Day, and the bomb getting dropped on Japan, because Oppenheimer's coming out in the next couple of days.
Tomorrow.
And then we go
I'm doing Barbie and Oppenheimer.
During Barbenheimer. All right, awesome. Good, good. The Barbenheimer doubleheader. And then we have a paragraph on communism, and then we jump right to the World Trade Center, and we're done. Like, Zoe may not know this because she's in Greece, and so I don't know how Greek students are taught, but in America, nobody under the age of I would say nobody under the age of 35 really knows anything about the Cold War. And so I worry that authors like Marquez, Kundera, this is where my concern is, those types of authors who are writing in very specific cultural and historical contexts will be forgotten. And so it's worthwhile to read them so that their lessons are not forgotten. because you're, to Dan's point, there is no new thing under the sun. And then you'll have the challenge, I think, is you'll have those very same people who've never read those books or never heard of those authors or never had those experiences historically. They will show up in the mid 21st century again, because tyrants always show back up again and they always try to reassert themselves. So, Jodah, go ahead.
I hear that 100%. Yes. I have nothing you said I would disagree with. I mean, obviously, we need to keep history front and center. And there's plenty of quotes about that. What is it? What's that famous Mark Twain line? It rhymes or something like that.
Yeah.
So that's a fact. But I'm kind of ensconced in this Milan Kundera, as Dan called it, skepticism. I'm not so skeptic of what I've read and what I've read about him. I'm confident this man had his thumb on a certain psychological, philosophical pulse of modern world. But I do want to I heard some themes there. One was that there is a focus on trying to rationalize yourself against what is perceptibly outside of yourself chaos of decision-making of other people. Like it becomes utterly impractical to completely judge your decision-making processes against your perception of the whys of other people, because you're never going to get there, possibly because they don't even know why they've done what they've done. So really, you need to focus on your own decision-making. Did I hear that correctly, Zoe? Was that kind of, or am I bastardizing that? Am I summarizing?
Basically, not just the decision-making, but also the interpretation of their behavior, the interpretation of their motivation. Focus on what's happening. That's the only thing you know, the actual facts of the situation. And then focus on yourself and your demands of every relationship. Like you mentioned, the unbearable lightness of being. This is a book about how not having a clear demand from a specific relationship can ruin both your life and the other person's life. You see these people that, in a sense, they live for each other, but they forget to live for themselves. And then they get entangled into lying and ethical skepticism and this trying to hold a moral ground. But what moral ground? Like you said, they didn't want to be together. And then they were both staying for the relationship for the sake of each other. No one just asked. No one just went there and say, hey, are you sure you want to do it? And both of them thought that the other person is too weak to sustain the breakup. Mm-hmm. How many people are finding themselves in these situations? And then we think about work. I know for a fact, because that's what I'm an organizational psychologist. So when we talk about the secrets at work, I know all of them. That's what they do. They tell me everything. So they're always, you go and there's this person who tells you, I should leave this company, but they wouldn't sustain one day without me. I just stay for them because it's the best for them and for my team. And